The North Island of New Zealand has just been subject to one of the most catastrophic weather events in New Zealand history. Devastation throughout multiple regions. Many have lost their homes or are trapped where they are due to slips or bridge washouts. Our hearts truly go out to everyone affected by these events, and if you're watching from the North Island, I hope you are safe and sound. North Island rivers that normally peacefully flow through their valleys turned into giants, moving with enough water to tear through mountains. Hundreds, even thousands of cubic meters of water rushing through these once small rivers, causing irreparable damage. But even after a once-in-a-century flood, these rivers are nothing but a trickle compared to New Zealand's most powerful river and its most wild region. This is the story of not only one of New Zealand's, but one of the world's most fierce rivers, from causing some of the largest floods ever recorded to holding some of the richest gold deposits in the world. This is a tale of a truly special place, the Buller River. The west coast of New Zealand. A wild, wet, untamed region. A region full of tectonic activity, where enormous mountains tear up straight from the sea. Combine that with the fact it's one of the wettest regions in the world, and you're going to be in for some rivers. Lots of rivers. And big rivers. Sure, by international standards, none of the West Coast rivers are particularly massive overall, due to all of them having very little distance between the source and the sea, and mountains channeling them directly to the ocean. However, for their catchment areas and length, they are amongst the largest in the world. Drive the length of the West Coast and you'll just hit big river after big river, every few minutes passing over yet another sizable body of water. These rivers, many of which were subject to gold rushes and have billions worth of fortune still waiting to be found, are nothing short of legendary. However, out of all these West Coast rivers, some really stand out as the largest and most impressive rivers of the region. Rivers like the Arawata, the Haast, the Cook, the Wataroa, the Wanganui, the Hokitika, Teramakau, Mokahanui, Karamea, and the Grey. But there is one river that truly stands out. One river to rule them all. The Buller. The Buller River is the largest and longest river on New Zealand's west coast, despite still being less than 170 kilometres long. Even just nationally, it doesn't rank particularly highly on the list of longest, widest, or even fastest flowing rivers. However, in terms of sheer power, it's a far, far different story. Despite not even making the top 10 longest rivers in New Zealand, it is the second largest in raw flow, and when it floods, it not only becomes the mightiest river in New Zealand, but utterly dwarfs almost every other river in the world. This is basically because of one reason, and really one reason alone. The West Coast is wet. This is a little poem I like that sums up the West Coast rain quite nicely. It's rained and rained and rained. The average fall was well maintained, and when the tracks were simple bogs, it started raining cats and dogs. After a drought of half an hour, we had a most refreshing shower. And then, most curious thing of all, a gentle rain began to fall. Next day but one was fairly dry, save for one deluge from the sky, which wetted the party to the skin, and then at last, the rain set in. I quite like that one. Right now, they have just recorded levels of rainfall of over 300 millimetres of rain over the course of this big storm in the North Island over the period of less than a week, which is still crazy and an absolute record for up there. However, that would just be a stroll in the park for the West Coast. There have been times recorded when over 1 100,000 millimeters of rain have fallen in areas of the west coast. And not just in 1 week, in a single night. Let that sink in for a second. Auckland and Wellington, two of New Zealand's largest cities, and both are considered very wet, rainy cities as far as things go, right? The west coast has rained more in 1 night than Auckland or Wellington receives in an entire year. This is why the rivers are so impressive and so incredibly dangerous. We've almost fell victim to them on more than one occasion, and hundreds, sadly probably even thousands of people have lost their lives in them over the years. It really shows you should never mess with nature, and definitely never trust the weather report. We learnt that the hard way, especially not on the west coast. But anyway, I think that's enough of an introduction, as I have a lot to cover, from geography to history to the floods. Let's get into it. The Buller River begins its journey in the famous Lake Rotoiti, flowing out of the lake's western side near the town of St. Arnaud. Already a decent-sized river with a fast torrent, it pours out of the lake, roaring downstream through a relatively wide, open valley, until it's met by its first decent tributary, the well-known, gold-bearing Howard River. From here, the Buller continues until it hits its first mountains, where not long after it meets its first big tributary, the Gowan River, which feeds out of Lake Rotoiti's twin lake, Lake Rotorua. Lake Rotorua is actually a lot larger than Lake Rotoiti, however the Gowan is not as large as the Buller at this point. But nevertheless, this instantly increases the Buller's size by over 50%. At this point, the Buller has beautiful deep blue, almost glacial looking water. It's incredible to see how much the colour changes as it runs further down, as the different colours of the different tributaries stain the river darker and greener. However, this is not because of pollution in any way, shape or form. Quite the opposite. It's because of the tannins of the incredible West Coast vegetation. The Buller continues through the valley at a decent size, with every few metres more and more smaller creeks feeding in. It continues down until it hits the Four Rivers Plain, where the gold rush town of Murchison is seated, and from here, everything changes. In just a stretch of a few kilometres, not one, not two, but 3 major tributaries feed into the Buller. The Mangles, the Maturi, and its most impressive tributary yet, the 60-kilometre long Matataki River. These 4 rivers converging has created a large open gravel plain, which has historically been the perfect location for a settlement amongst all the mountains. And so, the town of Murchison was built there to service the Upper Buller gold rushes, and it still stands well today with about 1,000 residents. After breaking through this plain and into the Upper Buller Gorge, the Buller is met by yet another massive tributary, the Mariura, and just below where these 2 rivers converge is where the Buller really gorges out. Huge walls of bedrock force the Buller into a deep raging channel, which is unimaginably deep and powerful. It roars down and thunders over the Araki Falls, which despite only being 5 metres high, the sheer volume of water flowing over them makes them truly impressive, and amongst one of the largest waterfalls, if you can even call it that, in the world in terms of sheer water volume. In this section of river, they operate regular jet boating tours, and the river is straddled by the Upper Buller Gorge swing bridge, which offers impressive views over the river. This is an area where we get our first glimpse of the river's underlying power. You look down to see debris miles above this already raging, roaring torrent of water, and shudder at the thought of what your fate might be if you fell into that river during a flood. You can hear the roars of rapids from kilometres away, the water dropping over bedrock flowing downstream. We believe the Maori originally named the river Kawaturi, meaning deep and swift, unstoppable. Remember that, unstoppable. During the 20th century, many of New Zealand's other large rivers like the Waikato, Waitaki, Waiau and Clutha fell victim to hydro schemes, and hydro developers saw the unimaginable amount of power the Buller could generate and eyed it up as well. However, even they soon realised this was a river that could not be tamed, and they too bowed their heads to the might of its flow. Downstream from the upper Buller Gorge, the Buller continues rapidly towards the coast, twisting through a variety of terrain, travelling through another more open plain before being met by one of its largest tributaries, probably its second largest, the famous dark brown Anangahua River, and entering the entrance of the lower Buller Gorge. When driving through the incredibly scenic lower Buller Gorge, you get to look down on the river metres below you, and realise that the water of this river was once roaring past so high it would have been above your head, and you can truly appreciate its almost surreal beauty. By this point it has turned a more beautiful green colour due to the different tributaries feeding in, and at this point it's close to reaching its full size. It continues down through the lower Buller Gorge, past Hawke's Crag and Uranium Point. It's somewhere down here, rumour has it that a gold nugget of almost 100 ounces was dredged out of the river in the early 1900s. It continues to flow, dawning closer and closer to its mouth, before being fed by its final major tributary, the Ahokanui River. You look upstream of the Ahokanui River, which is a sizable stream of its own, but you see debris literally dozens of metres above its flow, and find it impossible to fathom that that river can flood that high. And you would be correct. Despite it being a large creek, it's still not going to roar up that high. But it's because when the Buller is in flood, it rises so high that the Ahokanui backs up its valley, and debris flows down and settles at the height of the Buller's flood flows, a river well over 20 times as big as the Ahokanui. From here, the Buller finally leaves the mountains and travels for its last little bit of open land until it flows past the town of Westport and the Buller River Port, the nation's busiest river port, before finally travelling into the Pacific Sea. I haven't currently mentioned Westport much so far, but we will get to that soon, as it's very important. Before we get into the flooding and what the river is truly capable of, we should probably delve a bit deeper into the history of the river. Very little is known about any pre-European activity in the area. They have found sites of Moa butcher sites where items were carbon dated to be between the years of 1219 and 1316. But outside of that, there is almost no recorded history before the 1800s in the area, as invasion by northern tribes in the early 1800s made it difficult to pass on any substantial record of any of the traditional history, if there even was any, of the area. Fast forward to 1842, and this is when Europeans first discovered Lake Rotoiti at the top of the Buller. The first written record of the Buller River mouth was in 1845, when a captain of a sealing vessel reported as finding a large river a mile wide that appears to be navigable for a considerable distance. He then anchored his vessel and pulled up 5 miles up the Buller in his boat. He described the valley through which the river runs as finely wooded with some open land. In 1846, Thomas Brunner was the first European to follow the full length of the river. Together with his guide E. Kihu of Ngāti Tū Matakokuri, who already knew the area well. The expedition lasted over 550 days. The journey down the Buller was so difficult that they left Lake Rotoiti on the 31st of December 1846, but only reached the mouth on the 4th of June 1847. They returned up the Buller and reached Rotoiti again on the 12th of June 1848. Up until this point, the Buller area was entirely uninhabited, and of course the river was almost never used, as there was no one there to use it. As anyone who knows early New Zealand history will know, due to the terrain, vicious nature, and as I stated before, the rain, the west coast was originally considered as a hellhole,
never to be settled by any human in their right mind, until one discovery changed it all forever: the discovery of gold. Famous surveyor John Rockfort discovered gold and coal in the Buller Valley in 1859. Despite this indication of the land's potential hidden values, the 1860 Arahura deed sold most of the west coast to the government for £300, about a penny per 100 acres. What a scam, eh? The deed virtually included all of the Buller River. After gold was discovered, activity picked up in the region for the next few years, with a few hundred miners up and down the valley. However, things truly changed after the West Coast Gold Rush got into swing in 1864. The population boomed up, with huge towns like Lisle, Murchison and Inungahua popping up along the river to service the gold miners. Tens of thousands in the area, most looking for gold, but many mining coal or timber, or even servicing the prospectors. By 1867, partly also thanks to the Charleston and Brighton gold rushes further south as well, Westport had sprung up to well over 3,000 residents in 1868, giving it a similar size to today, making Westport one of the West Coast's only towns that has a similar size today as it did during the gold rush. All the others have obviously died down. But sure enough, as with any gold rush town, the geographical location was what was practical for the short term, not necessarily long-term planning. Sure, Westport is an incredible location, with the Buller River as its port and it being a hub to the northern west coast, but being trapped between two rivers, Westport also has a river flowing directly to the north of the town, the Orawati River, which also serves as an overflow for the Buller River. However, this river is far, far smaller than the Buller, but it can still roar up and provide a serious risk to the town when in flood, especially when the Buller is overflowing into it. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, the Buller River area got more developed. After the gold rush, the population dwindled, and it has never returned to those numbers again. However, things like bridges, paths, railways, and roads were built up and down the river. Throughout history, many massive floods have ravaged the region, including the record-breaking floods in 1926, which is said to dwarf even our modern recent floods we've had. Also, many other various floods have happened throughout the past, being major floods happening all the time, and massive floods happening every few years. Many of these have destroyed many bridges and roads up and down the river in the past. Along the Buller, it is said the locals say that the river is like a neighbour who will get drunk and violent. We may build roads, bridges, even overflows and stop banks. We may pretend we are in control, but the river will always have the last word, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. Many of you may be wondering by now how the Buller was originally named. Well, when Charles Heafy and Thomas Brunner explored the Buller, they reported back to William Fox, the New Zealand Company agent at the time, who then reported back to Colonel Wakefield and stated, "As it will present a considerable gesture on the map of this island, I have called it the Buller, named after Charles Buller, a UK Member of Parliament and Director of the New Zealand Company." A bit of a random origin name at the time, to be honest, but it is still quite a cool origin for the name. The Buller is a river full of gold. As I said, numerous gold rushes took place along it and its tributaries. In Lisle, one of the Buller's feeder creeks, and the current gold fossicking area in the region, which is sadly the only place left in the area the public can carry on this legacy. It was said the nuggets simply needed to be picked up like seashells. A group of free prospectors found close to 50 kilograms of gold in a day, the modern equivalent value of over $5 million. Quite literally, millionaires overnight. It is said someone else unearthed a nugget of 108 ounces, which would have been the largest ever found in the country. However, it was never officially recorded, probably to avoid the gold tax, so modern authorities can't take it as a fact. After the original rush, large dredges began to work up and down the main Buller River, recovering over the years, quite literally, billions in gold. However, this was no longer the free-spirited industry of lone prospectors working, making their own wage. It was all run by massive companies along with the government, which is sadly, in a lot of ways, exactly what it's like today. During the gold rush, all the towns up and down the river relied on river freight from Westport for supplies. Canoes and supply boats travelling up and down the Buller, sometimes taking weeks to reach their destinations, all with the fear of God forbid what might happen if the river flooded. This caused freight and supplies to be exceptionally expensive on the towns up and down the Buller, but this didn't stop any of the gold rushes, which goes to show how rich they must have been. Now, onto our final chapter of the story, the quakes, Westport, and its floods. In 1929, the 7.6 magnitude Murchison earthquake ravaged the west coast and the Buller River. The Murchison earthquake was so loud, rumblings could be heard 250 kilometres away, far into the North Island. It devastated the west coast and the Buller River, and ended many lives. An entire mountain slipped into the Buller River, which the river ripped through in just 2 days. This was one of the worst disasters in New Zealand history. However, in 1968, there was another major earthquake, a slightly smaller and technically less catastrophic earthquake, be it still a disaster. However, this quake did something truly scary. In 1968, the magnitude 7.1 Nangahua earthquake hit, shaking strong enough to fling people out of bed and devastate the countryside. This earthquake also caused another landslide. A blockage 50 metres tall roared down, half a mountain blocking the Buller Valley and its river. And the water build-up began. Almost 500 cubic metres a second of water being built up behind the dam. That equates to 1.8 million cubic metres of water an hour, or 43.2 million cubic metres of water a day, building up higher and higher behind that dam. And unlike the Murchison quake, the river wasn't just washing it away, it was building up and showing signs of possible bursting. A lake of 5 kilometres long and extremely deep built up along the valley, enough water to erase any civilization and all life from Nangahua to Westport in a matter of minutes. Nangahua was evacuated. However, this impending doom didn't stop the gold prospectors. The blockage caused the river level to drop to almost nothing below the dam, so eager prospectors went in with their pans and shovels to dig into that bedrock, once submerged under meters of roaring water. I'm sure many of them probably struck it pretty rich that day. However, I'm not even sure we would take that risk. This seemed like it was about to be the worst disaster in New Zealand history, and one of the worst natural disasters in the planet's history. However, luckily, the river kept rising and eventually overflowed the dam instead of bursting it down, and it gradually wore it down bit by bit so no titanic tsunamis were caused. However, this truly showed the hidden dangers an earthquake this scale can cause. The Buller River, as I stated before, has the second largest average discharge of any river in New Zealand. It will usually flow at around 500 cubic metres a second, which is a ginormous quantity of water on its own. It's still nothing to go super crazy about internationally. However, as I stated, when it floods, it's a different story. The river can reach flows of 5,000, 10,000, even 15,000 or 20,000 cubic metres and beyond. Not only by far the highest flood flows in New Zealand, but the highest flood flows of any river its size in the world. And even ignoring size, just comparing it flow versus flow to other continental super huge rivers, dozens of times its size, it's amongst the largest in the world and dwarfs almost every other river on the planet when it floods. It can have 10 times the flow of the Nile River, which is the longest river on the entire planet. Even though the Nile is 50 times the length of the Buller, it's utterly dwarfed by the Buller when the Buller is in flood. And that is what is truly scary about the river. The highest floods we've recorded since the river has been monitored were actually in very recent years, as I stated before. We've had 2 major Buller River floods seriously threatening Westport in the past few years, causing many homes to be evacuated and a lot of land to be destroyed or damaged. It burst its stop banks and flooded the town. The Orawati River overflow of the Buller was in full swing, with the Buller River pouring down there as well. You looked at Westport from satellite and it was quite literally an island with no way out, trapped between the sea and quite literally the Buller and the Buller. During these rainfalls, it recorded flood flows of well over 15,000 cubic meters a second, which, as I stated, is an unbelievable amount of water. This already flooded most of the town, caused everyone to evacuate in a state of emergency. Huge amount of infrastructure and land damaged or destroyed. Even larger floods were shown in the years 1926 as well. However, what was truly scary about these recent floods is that 90% of the water came from only 25% of the Buller's catchment. It goes to show the utterly insane amount of water that must have rained down on those areas. Something only an area like the West Coast is capable of. So that goes to show 90% of the water from 25% of the catchment. If it rained that hard over the entire catchment, the Buller would be 4 times the size it was during that flood, reaching flows of 60,000 cubic meters a second. Theoretically, of course. If that happened, I don't even want to say. It would be destruction. But luckily with the West Coast, extremely West Coast rain is generally somewhat localised and normally won't engulf the entire region. Certainly not over the Buller's entire catchment, normally at least. And luckily, due to the West Coast region being an area used to such incredible amounts of rain, most cyclones or hurricanes would be a stroll in the park for a region. Even the recent cyclone that sadly devastated most of the North Island would likely be nothing more than widespread, relatively heavy rain for the West Coast. It wouldn't cause a massive state of emergency or any damage out of the normal. However, it's only a matter of time until a West Coast rainstorm widespread enough and heavy enough ravages the region and causes the Buller to grow even larger again. And even with our overflows and our stop banks, nothing will be able to stop the river. A bit more funding, they could reinforce and upsize the overflows and stop banks, which would allow a bit more tolerance to the floods. But it seems to be only a matter of time till the right combination of weather comes along, and trapped between the sea and the Buller, it may only be a matter of time before the Buller River awakens and Westport meets its likely, inevitable doom. Or on the other, hopefully more likely hand, a flood like this may never happen in any of our lifetimes, and by the point it does, if it ever does, we might have managed to make enough infrastructure that the river may no longer be as much of a threat, even if there is a once in a millennia West Coast flood. Thanks a heap for sticking along, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe learnt a thing or two. This video quite literally took hundreds of hours to make, from researching to recording and putting it all together. And I would just like to give a massive thank you to all our channel patron supporters for making it possible. If you're interested in helping support the channel a bit more while receiving some awesome perks, make sure to check the link in the description below. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know in the comments, but outside of that, I'll see you on the next one.